Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to Connecticut's Old State House. Thank you all for coming out on this rainy day. We really appreciate it. And we're glad to have you with us today. It's hard to believe that it's already November when we talked about this so many months ago. We would invite you to join us in a couple of weeks and get in the holiday spirit for our upcoming holiday shopping fair, which is coming back to Connecticut's Old State House on December 4th, 5th, and 6th. And then on December the 10th, join us for the next conversation at noon, No More Pink Teas, all about the militant surge for women's suffrage. Today, we have a real treat because we are able to welcome our state's state librarian, Mr. Kendall Wiggin. It's really always fun to welcome a special friend to the Old State House, and we've worked with Ken over many years on our various programs here at Connecticut's Old State House, from public programs to Connecticut History Day, and all manner of things in between, so it's great to have you here. Ken is preparing to retire after 21 years as the state librarian. He is the 10th state librarian in the 150-year history of the Connecticut State Library, which was established by an act of the Connecticut General Assembly in May of 1854. The collections were first kept in the state houses in Hartford and New Haven, meaning they were kept here in this building, so it's appropriate to have you here today. And then, of course, after the current state capitol was built, and then finally the state library is now housed in the current state library building, which was constructed in 1910. The state librarian is appointed by the State Library Board and serves as the chief administrative officer of the board. Prior to arriving in Connecticut, Ken had worked in academic and public libraries in New Hampshire, where he also served as the state librarian for 8 years. He is a graduate of the Simmons Graduate School of Library and Information Science. Over the past 16 years, Ken has worked closely with the Association of the Connecticut Library Boards, the Connecticut Library Association, the Connecticut Library Consortium, the Friends of Connecticut Libraries, and others to advance library service to the citizens of Connecticut. Ken has served on a variety of boards and commissions, and currently he serves on the Governor's Executive Information Technology Strategy and Investment Committee, the Commission on Educational Technology, and Connecticut History Online Management Committee, the Selection Committee for the Hale Awards, and is a member of the Connecticut Academy of Arts and Sciences. He is the current president of the Chief Officers of State Library Agencies and has served in many capacities for the American Library Association, including as a past chair of ALA's Committee on Legislation. Please join me in welcoming Mr. Kendall Wiggin to the Old State House.
Thank you, Rebecca. It's a pleasure to be here.
Glad to have you. We have some questions for Ken to just think about as he reflects on his upcoming retirement on January the 1st. But as you know, those of you who've been to the Old State House before, our Conversations at Noon programs, please feel free to ask any questions. We're just going to ask, though, that if you have a question, if you could wait for a microphone to get to you so that we can hear what your question is. And as you probably already noticed, this program is being filmed by the Connecticut Network, so please don't do anything you don't want your mother to see. She watches you on TV, because you can watch it online all over the country, so Mom can see you. So Ken, it's great to have you with us today. What first got you interested in becoming a librarian?
That's a great question, because I grew up, my mother being a librarian, but I had no idea what she did. But when I went to college, I did work study in the college library. Then on Sunday afternoons, I worked in the public library, a small little town library. And while I was at college, we also had an opportunity to go tour the Library of Congress, a behind-the-scenes tour. And I think those three things really inspired me or got me interested in doing library work. Although don't tell my mother that. She still thinks she's the reason.
Excuse me. We actually take our History Day students to the Library of Congress, so I can definitely see why it would hook you into wanting to be a librarian. Were you always a big reader as you grew up?
Not really.
interesting.
I always tell kids when I go to speak before students who are at various reading things, I said, just because I'm a state librarian doesn't mean I'm a voracious reader. I believe people put words on the page for a reason. I read them all. But I waxed and waned. A lot of history books, not so much pleasure. Now I'm kind of the other way around. I get out of the professional reading and then I do more just for pleasure reading. But I was never, that doesn't make a librarian, being a good reader. It helps, but.
Interesting. So I know before you came to Connecticut, you were the state librarian for New Hampshire. What kind of led you to come south a little bit to Connecticut?
So my standard line is I wanted to move to a warmer climate and a greater gardening zone. It was the opportunity. I mean, New Hampshire State Library, if you've seen one state library, you've seen them all, or you've only seen one. They're all very different. And when I saw the job down here, had the archives, the public records, the museum, had so many opportunities to do more than just what I was doing. So I was really interested in that. And so I applied and got the job.
Great. Well, Connecticut's lucky to have you. So before today's program, you mentioned to me that the state library really has a dual mission. Can you talk a little bit about what those missions are? How do you balance the two? And how does the library kind of do it all?
Sure. So part of the mission is to preserve and make accessible Connecticut's history and heritage. The other part of the mission is to advance library services statewide. So the two sides of the house. On the first part of our mission, the state library, as I said, is also the state archives. We manage public records for the state. We have a large collection of materials. We're a federal depository library, state depository library. So our collections really support the history piece. And we've been doing more and more to make them accessible by more processing, more finding aids, digitizing more of the materials. So that's part of that mission, and also doing conservation work on our collections. The advancing the library services side falls to the Division of Library Development. And every state receives some federal funding to support that mission. And so we get that funding and we administer it through the division. So that side is doing statewide programs, whether it's our delivery service, your ability to borrow material from any library in the state. We fund statewide databases for academic, public, and school libraries. So we do a lot of funding of state services and also a lot of training and development. These days we're putting a lot into leadership development. So those are the two sides. My job is to try to, it's like, which is your favorite child? I have to try to work with all of them, and we try to integrate them. I mean, there are many times where we will bring a history program or let's say a conservation workshop, and we'll work that through the library development. So we're bringing in libraries into that. So there's a lot of balancing between the two.
And compared to other states, how does the kind of Connecticut library system?
So Connecticut, there's two parts. The state library is one of the most extensive in terms of responsibilities. Alaska, Arizona, and Connecticut really have everything. Connecticut, of course, we have no county, so we have no county library systems. Many people come to the state have been in a state that had a county library system, so they're used to that. We have 164 principal public libraries in the state, and we have over 200 libraries. Some towns have more than one library, separately administered. So we're a little different in that way, but on the other hand, our libraries cooperate quite effectively with each other and share a lot of resources. So we're well known around the country for our resource sharing efforts.
Great. And it must be a challenge every year, though, with federal funding that you rely on that comes through.
Well, federal and state. The federal is dependent on our maintaining our state funding, which has always been a challenge. And it's not one of Congress's biggest programs. I mean, a lot of us are in, whether it's National Endowment of Humanities money or arts money or IMLS, Institute Museum and Library Services funds, they're often a target of let's just get rid of those. But we've been very effective in keeping funding for all those programs. And we really do a lot with a very small amount of that money.
What is the staffing level? Is it similar to when you came here 20 years ago, or has it really?
So when I
you're
came,
doing...
yeah, so 20 years ago, it was like 126 people. We're down to 87 or so people now. So we've lost a lot of people over time. And that's been hard to make up. I mean, we used to be open Monday through Saturday. Now we're open Tuesday through Saturday. And we've had to cut back on a lot of things. And there's some things we just don't do anymore. We had to pick and choose.
Yeah.
And, you know, the public wants everything, and we can't do everything. So we're trying to balance that with the needs of our heavy users and the constituencies that we're most trying to serve.
With the, you know, sometimes I think I shared with you that my mother and my grandmother were librarians, so I've always been raised, we go to the library. And, you know, sometimes I'll see things on the internet talking about how with technology, people don't need libraries anymore, which, you know, can you talk a little bit about how technology has impacted libraries and why are libraries still important in the 21st century?
Sure, those are great questions. And I don't get it as much these days, probably because I've answered most of the people that ask me the same question. You know, in this age of the internet or Google, why do we need libraries? And I think what people that say that don't understand that it isn't just about going online and answering a question. Libraries build collections to support research, to help people answer questions, to help them through questions they may have in their own lives. And we try to build balanced collections. And I think in this day and age of fake news or, you know, challenging what is real, libraries still have resources that people can trust. And I think librarians are listed, anytime you see a survey, we're right up there with some of the most trusted people working in, at least for state and local governments. I think there also the aspect of, you know, digital literacy is a real issue, as I was saying to you. Libraries are really focused now, not just on the collections they have, but on providing services to help people throughout their lifetimes. Public libraries are the only institution I know that is responsible for serving everybody from birth to death, basically. That's a wide range of people and changes over time. So digital literacy is a real important one. People often say to me, you know, well, there's a whole generation that's born digital, and I go, no, they're not. They may know how to use the cell phone or some technology, but they don't know how to discern what they're finding. You know, how do they decide, well, that really is accurate information, that somebody just made that up and put it out there on Facebook or whatever. So there's the digital literacy, financial literacy. I mean, we live in a time where, you know, managing money from the time you're, you know, a kid, that's high school, young adult, married, couple, retirement, you know, all these, they're constantly changing, and so you have to keep learning how to do that. Certainly, health literacy is another big role libraries are playing to help people through this maze of, I mean, it's complicated being, you know, needing medical care nowadays, and so libraries are there to help people and, you know, give them more resources and information. And then the list just goes on. I mean, there's a lot we can do. Civic engagement. I mean, public libraries are one of the last public meeting spaces where we can bring people together and have conversations and learn to talk with each other. And so I think libraries are filling a role that's way beyond the fact that you can just go look it up on the internet. But we are utilizing the technology. E-books are extremely popular. E-audio books are extremely popular. And we've been building platforms to try to help deliver those better. Libraries are facing a real challenge these days because of the technology or perceived difference between an audiobook and a real book. And libraries are challenged by having to have all formats nowadays. So it's not just the printed book, it may be the recorded version, it may be the large print version, it may be whatever version. But we have publishers now that are trying to blame libraries for the lack of sales and are holding back letting libraries buy ebooks. So this is an area of great tension right now. The internet has made that possible. And so I think libraries are finding their niche and continuing to evolve. I mean, if you walked into a library in 1900, it's going to be very different service-wise than it is today.
Well, it's interesting that you mentioned all the things that libraries do, because I know the town where I live, our public library has so many programs, whether it's for, you know, little ones, you know, from birth through toddler and story hours and things like that, but also just programming free concerts, and it really is kind of a hub of the whole community.
Well, it is, and I think it's a place that realizes that we still need face-to-face interaction in our society, and so we bring people together. If you're a young couple with a child and you don't have a big support system around, well, you can come meet other people at the library. And I mean, toddler story hours and bedtime story hours and all of those help with social interaction. They help everybody involved learn better. So I think that nationally and even here in Connecticut, our public programming is a huge number. It's like more people go to public library programs than fill all of the sports arenas in America in a year or something. I mean, it's a staggering number, but it's a very important number and service that's provided.
Well, even at the State Library, I don't think a ton of people know just some of the kind of initiatives that you've done, like with recognizing or commemorating, I should say, the recent anniversary of World War I, and just that kind of project.
Yeah, and so a lot of those, I mean, we struggle with how to make more people aware of what the services we have, and we're not great at all the advertising. But we do also try to build on the collections. And because we can't digitize everything, we have millions of items, and if you count everything in every archival folder, it's tens of millions. So how do you digitize all that? And what we tried to do is focus on, well, what's the current event or what's the current subject? So World War I gave us an opportunity to expand on our collection. The State Library actually was given the responsibility as the War Records Department before World War I ended, and has continued that role of collecting the military history of the state in many ways. But we realized that, how do we get people involved? They have papers and letters at home. It's already almost a generation removed. So we started doing digitization days around the state, and people brought in all kinds of wonderful things. And in some cases, they donated them to the State Library. In other cases, they allowed us to digitize them and make them available. But it augments the governmental side of a story, and those personal letters and papers of people, their artifacts. Those are really important to have, and we didn't necessarily have all that in our collection. So working with libraries and museums around the state, or historical societies around the state, it was an opportunity to get into communities more to gather that information. Now we're moving on to suffrage. That's our next big thing. You're all involved in that.
That's right, yeah.
But I think it's a great way to introduce people to the services we all have and our responsibilities for preserving that history and making it accessible.
Is it normal for state libraries really because it must be hard to just try to maintain what you have, but then also to collect in the present day for the future? Do you, as a repository, you have the responsibility of holding on to some government documents, but are you able to kind of also be proactive with collecting?
Yeah, that's a really good question, and we have to balance that out. We're very lucky. I mean, sometimes we're better collectors than we are of interpreters. So we don't have great, our exhibits are somewhat limited, and our funding for that is limited, but we have been able to continually acquire like museum objects. We're quite active in that because we have some private funding for that, and that money has sustained that. People are still quite generous. Families find a trove of papers, and when you get them past the Antiques Roadshow thing that like, this is not going to set you up for life by selling this, and that it's intrinsically more valuable than it is, let's say, on the market. And so we'll have people still donate a lot of interesting papers. We had a wonderful collection of War of 1818 material that we didn't know it was out there.
Oh, wow.
So things do surface. We find things. We're very active. My staff is on the internet. We watch eBay a lot. We buy a lot from eBay. A lot of things left Connecticut and went elsewhere. People moved with them, moved those objects. So, and we have a small amount of money to do that. Our state funding is really limited for materials, but that we are able to do. It's like we collect all of the state's newspapers, and that's not an easy thing to maintain. We've been very lucky for the last number of years to receive National Endowment Humanities funding for the newspaper project. So we've been digitizing about 100,000 pages a year, which doesn't sound like a lot, but it's a lot, of papers that aren't as commonly held out there. So yes, it's a struggle, but at times we work really hard at that. We still do some exchanges with states on some materials.
Oh, wow.
And we sometimes find things and we'll send it to another institution. They may find things and send them to us. So.
And so that kind of begs the question of storage. I know that you have off-site storage facilities, but
so that's the constant need of a library. So when the library was here, the first state librarian had all kinds of things to say about the limited space, the bad lighting, the conditions, and that precipitated eventually moving into the new Capitol in 1878. And there, the state library started to take over space as well. They were building the portrait collection of the governors. They were adding, materials everywhere. And part of the impetus to have the state library was to kind of pull together all the books and papers that were sitting around in people's offices. Well, once you have a place, people start bringing it in. And it just kept growing and growing. And so then you had the need for the new state library, which was a wonderful thing. And it gave the state the opportunity to start expanding collections because they had more space. It was built as a fire resistant. My father was a fire chief. Nothing's fireproof, but it was a fire resistant building. And if you go in there today, some of what looks like woodwork, knock on it, it's actually metal. But it's really cool. So after that was opened, in 1921, the Massachusetts Historical Society decided to give back to the state what are called the Trumbull Papers. These are things that had left the state over 100 plus years ago. The Trumbull family had taken them out to their home during the Revolutionary War to protect them, and then they never came back. They ended up at Massachusetts Historical. But the state library at that time wasn't in a position to really be collecting. Now they were. So one of my predecessors, George Goddard, was an avid collector. I like to say in some ways he was a hoarder, but that's okay. I mean, we have a lot of things we wouldn't have otherwise, be they artifacts or papers. So the State Library, again, is in a space crunch. The building was added onto in the late 60s, and that maintained some of that. Now we have a facility down on Van Block Street, which houses most of the archives, at least the 20th century archives, and some collections from the library and the museum. But we're constantly evaluating collections and where we can multiply the space, but it's difficult.
Yeah.
But it's a good thing.
A good problem to have, right? Do we have questions from the audience? Hang on 1 second, we'll get you a microphone. Yep. So we can hear you loud and clear.
Thank you. You'll be happy to know that my class, as we are speaking, is using Chronicling America, which is the digitalized newspaper.
It's a wonderful resource.
So very good resource. So I'm wondering about, in terms of the collections, the role of the stacks in the State Library, and which has not only papers but books and publications. It's my perception that hasn't been kept up, that we have the old volumes. So what's the place of that, and is that going to be maintained in the future?
The State Library, our legal collection takes precedence over most things, and that's been kept up pretty well. Because we are the principal law library for the state, and so providing both the courts, the executive branch, and even the legislature with access to that material has been important. So we keep that up to the best of our ability, but we also collaborate with the Quinnipiac, UConn, and Yale in terms of not necessarily overlapping collections or where are they stronger, where are we weaker. And history and genealogy is another area where we try to really put some resources. Inevitably, there's parts of the collection that we just can't keep up to date with. But being a full federal depository library, actually we're regional for Rhode Island and Connecticut, we still get a lot of paper, but we have access to a lot of electronic things, and we get things in a lot of other formats. So that's a strong collection as well.
So if I may ask one other question.
Sure.
I'm wondering about outreach to town and regional libraries, and if there's coordination between the state library and local libraries as to their collecting strategies for historical material.
The short answer is no. We have had a number of funded projects where we've been working with historical societies and libraries that hold collections to better maintain their collections, to understand what's needed for conservation of those collections. The fact that they do need a collection development policy, to that extent, yes. We try to distill those best practices, instill those in people, but that's something that, as a state agency, we can't tell people what to do because we have no money for a really good stick. But we do provide a lot of best practices out there and a lot of guidance and consulting when we're asked to.
Question.
So the way the state library is now, how do you guys plan to evolve it 20 years from now? So the success of it right now, how would you like to see it 20 years from now?
That's a really good question. The bottom line is I'd like to see it better funded. In 2011, there was a proposal to get rid of the state library, which was very disheartening, but we came back from that. I think that more and more of the collections will be available online. There'll be better tools to use those collections, but the collections will continue to grow and document. I mean, our challenge right now is even documenting this time period. There's just so much material out there. How do we do that? But I think we'll have overcome that. But I think that, it'll still be a respected institution and one that people will turn to when they need information, whether they can get it online or through the staff. And the museum will be, maybe better interpreting the collections for people and having more exhibits than we do now. We've been very limited in that scope. But those would be, I'd like to just see it continue to grow. When you look at its history, it has evolved and managed to take in the next layer of technology. We don't know what that technology is going to be. And we are challenged right now with people's expectation of privacy, which libraries greatly, honor. But a lot of our materials have personally identifiable information. You write the governor, you may have told the governor all kinds of things that we can't let other people see. So we're dealing with how do you take those, and a lot of that's digital today, how do we present that to the public, but redact what needs to be redacted. It's a real challenge. But I think over time we will overcome all those things and things will become more seamless.
Mine's kind of a follow-up question. Ken, in terms of your position, how will it be filled when you retire? Is this a state librarian? Is that an appointment, or is that something somebody applies for? How does the system work? And my question also kind of goes for the state historian and all those kinds of roles.
So the position, I work for a board. The board has 5 appointees from the governor, 4 legislative appointees, the chief justice or designee, the chief court administrator or designee, and the commissioner of education or designee. So it's unique now, and it's one of the only boards operating an agency that the governor does not have total control over. So the board began, I gave them a long time. I told them in March I was leaving. So they had a search committee work over the summer, came up with names which have been passed on. The board's done some interviewing, and they will do some more interviewing in the following week. My hope is they'll have someone in place. But it's like when I came here, I had to learn a lot. I didn't know a lot about archives. I didn't know a lot about a lot of things. But I had some background by being in a state library and having worked in many different types of public libraries. So I think the challenge for the new, or my successor, will be that ability to reach out and work with people. That's key. I mean, I show up at a lot of things. People say to me, what's the state librarian doing here? I go, why shouldn't I be here? We need to learn what's going on and do all of that. The state historian is a position that's now appointed through the University of Connecticut. At one time, it was appointed by the State Library Board. When I came here, there was some yin and yang going on about that, but it's worked out well. But in my job, I mean, I've made a point to work with the history community, to work with, I work a lot with town clerks because we're responsible for all the town records. So we have to build those relationships, and I hope if a new person has no other skill, it's how to work with all these different groups and how to work with the legislature, because that's a key thing. The State Library is able to do its own advocacy over the legislature.
Questions?
I was just thinking a minute back to where we might be. When I started in New Hampshire in 1989, 1990, I famously sent this memo to my reference department. What's this thing called the internet? And they wrote back a really interesting response because we didn't know a lot about it. I mean, it was a military, it was DARPA and it was all that stuff, but the commercial use of it didn't take place till I became a state librarian. And so when I came here 8 years later, we were still trying to just learn, what are we going to do with this wonderful technology? And I think we're still learning what to do with it. And so I'm hoping in 20 years we'll have figured that out and we'll have some new challenging technology that we need to figure out.
Well, because I was wondering as you were talking, just with the recent change of administrations, I would imagine a lot of communication is not by letter, it's by email. So how do you save those kinds of records and save it? Because I did my thesis for grad school long enough that the technology is different. I couldn't actually play it because I don't have something to.
That's a great question. In Connecticut, the State Library does receive, or the State Archives receives, all gubernatorial papers. Not true in some states. So with Governor Malloy's papers, it was the first time we decided to just go ahead and take everything in electronic. That was electronic, we'll take it in electronically. Believe it or not, under Governor Rell's administration, we had them print out most of the emails because we didn't know what to do with it. But we're getting better at that. This was also an administration that had a lot of social media, was on a lot of social media platforms. So learning to take over those accounts and preserve those accounts, because those services don't offer that particularly. And then how do you make it accessible? How do you make people understand that he's no longer governor, so don't respond? It's an interesting thing. Because a lot of agencies still have on their websites links to these things from previous administrations. So it becomes a little challenging. But it is something we're learning to do. We've acquired some new tools that allow us to access the hard drives without writing to them and corrupting the files, because it's all about provenance and about chain of ownership and things. So those are things that we've had to deal with. I know the University of Connecticut is undertaking an effort to take all the theses and dissertations and get them all electronic. We have, for a number of years, worked with the University of Connecticut libraries to develop the Connecticut Digital Archive, which is an attempt to have a repository, a trusted repository, where we know that what we put in there today we'll be able to read and use 20 years from now. So some formats will automatically be updated if there's a replacement for PDF. The system is going to have to replace everything. So it's a challenge. I mean, there are a lot of formats today that nobody can read. We still have floppy disk drives. We have all kinds of things. So what do you do with all of that? And that's a challenge for today's archivists, and one that we're working hard at. And I think a lot of our folks are really in the forefront of some of that work.
Over the 2 decades you've been state librarian, what have been some of the biggest adaptations that you've led to help the library better meet the needs of the citizens of Connecticut?
That's a good question. One of the things that, and none of these that I do myself, but it's always in partnership, but I think the evolution of the Connecticut Education Network has been a key piece of that. Connecticut's one of the few states that decided to build its own education network, and libraries have always, because I showed up at the meetings, libraries have always been included. So academic, public, and school libraries, we have a really powerful, high-speed network. Over the last several years, I got some state funding to bring broadband to a lot of libraries that didn't have broadband. That was sort of the weak link on it. They all had access to the education network, but not necessarily at the speeds they needed. So we've been bringing broadband into all those communities. And it's a partnership. They have to find the funding for the ongoing maintenance of it. But that has really helped. I mean, when you think how much is going on digitally, people are coming in and expecting the Wi-Fi to be working for them. They want to download this, download that. They're at the computers. Maybe they're doing online applying for a job somewhere, all of the workforce development kinds of activities, all takes bandwidth. And so expanding that bandwidth has been one of the best, adaptations we've had to make, because it just was very, I remember, do you ever remember modems and the sound your modem made and the dial-up access? That was here, that was a reality. And, so we've moved that far ahead. I think another thing that we realized the need for funding for historic preservation. And while the state's been very good at funding physical, like building preservation, not so much on documents. And so the establishment of the Historic Document Preservation Fund, which is funded out of a filing fee on land recordings, has allowed us over the years to give over $10 million back to communities to do preservation work, do records management work. And that's been a really wonderful, powerful tool to have. And then just bringing the whole concept of digitizing, which, people don't understand the complexity. It's one thing to scan your pictures. It's another thing to have all the metadata so you can find all those pictures. How much have you got up in the cloud that you don't really know where it is? How do you search that? So that's the challenge we face. But I think we've brought in the technology, we've adapted it to our uses, and we're continually looking at new ways to utilize the technology.
Great. Can you, I know this is something of particular interest to you, just the access to historical records. What trends do you see happening?
Yeah, so when I came to Connecticut, one of the things that really impressed me was the open records laws in our state. I mean, it was really powerful. That basically, you could look at everything. What I've seen over the last number of years is an erosion of that for a lot of different reasons. I mean, I think as people have become concerned about their personal information, they're shocked that the state has some of that, and that some of that is public record. And so I think there's been a movement in the legislature to push back on some of that open records. Where we've seen it at the State Library is we hold in the archives a lot of records that have various levels of confidentiality attached to them. And it's become harder and harder for us to release information through some of those files. We have a lot of records of the various state hospitals in the state. And we are constantly running, head to head with some of the mental health folks over what should be allowed to be accessed and not. They're okay with statistical, when you look at it statistically, historians like to look at it from the personal side. You want to know. I mean, here you have a soldier comes back from World War I, suddenly he's off the radar for a while, and then suddenly he reappears, in the records. What happened? We'd like to know what happened. And so while it's, families can have access, so should historians. And that's been, and I've been most focused on how do we have a better way of accessing restricted records in the archives, because they range all over the place. And by and large, I think it would better inform the public if they saw how things worked at various state institutions. How was people's care? I mean, taxpayers were paying for that. And so my, thing has been, we should have access to those records within some limits. I've offered, okay, wait 100 years after the person dies. Is that not a reasonable length of time for privacy? So we've brought this to the legislature for the last number of sessions, and a little successful, not so successful, but we haven't really accomplished that yet. And I think that's something that we need to look at as a society. If we're going to maintain a record of our government's actions and history, are you just going to close it to people for what reasons? So I think there are a lot of sensitive issues that we have to deal with. There may have been things 200 years ago that people would have thought were sensitive. Today, we think nothing of it.
Well, I remember hearing about this when there was research being done on Civil War topics. Yeah. And you'd think that the 1860s was enough time to,
You would think. The fact that somebody was in a state hospital, I mean, the irony is you can often go to a census record and find out where they were because the family said, oh, they're in the state hospital. And it's not to put labels on people, it's to help better understand the times.
Right.
I mean, a lot of soldiers came back from the Revolutionary, we don't know about the Revolutionary War. There could have been PSD then too, but if you look at the Civil War, and then now we're looking at World War I, we can't look at those, if those soldiers were in a state hospital for any reason, we can't look at those, the time has been limited. So I think we need to look at that more carefully, and for positive purposes. This isn't just to exploit these records, but
Right.
how do you tell a really good human story if you don't know about the person?
and is that a trend nationally or just here in Connecticut?
I think there are some states that don't have really good open records laws. But I think there is pushback. I think part of it is, there's been a lot of there's several levels. There's the identity theft issue, so people are worried about that, and they should be, but there are ways we can protect that. I think there's just different views on some topics of people who think it's okay to know that, and there are people that no way should you know that. And does your privacy devolve to your family? Mm-hmm. I mean, it's your privacy. It's not their privacy. And that's a debate I get into with people. But I think it's something we need to have more conversation about before we start locking everything up and hidden away. Because we're not going to be able to reflect on our time. 50 years from now, and people want to go back and see what we were doing, they're going to be told, I'm sorry, you can't look at that.
Right. And it's interesting, the whole issue of Civil War soldiers, because in World War I as well, that post-traumatic stress wasn't as understood back then, and could there be lessons to be learned from studying people of the past to issues that soldiers are facing today?
Well, and I mean, some of the agencies will tell you, well, we allow researchers to go and do statistical analysis. Well, statistical analysis is interesting, but maybe by putting names and faces to those statistics, we learn a lot more. Mm-hmm. We learn, where did they live? That may not show up in the statistical record. What was affecting their lives at the time? We don't know that. So you just get a more whole view when you can look at everything.
Well, it'll be interesting to see
Yeah,
how that
yeah.
continues. Does anyone have any questions? Oh,
I have a big voice. I could probably be heard with the microphone in the back room. So I'm wondering, especially with the advent of digital technology, has the user population of the library changed over the course of your tenure at the library?
That's a really good question, and I think, yes, there are people who may not have utilized library resources when they were just physical objects and are now using the technology, using ebooks where they may not have. I find that a lot of readers read in all types of genres. So they may have a book going, they may have an audio on the way to work, and they may use ebooks for whatever reason. So it's hard to get a handle on that. I mean, readership is really up in like ebooks and audiobooks. Book use is leveled off or gone down a little. So circulation is an interesting, and it's not the only measure of libraries anymore. And I've been on a national committee looking at how do we derive better statistics that tell our story better. There's also an expectation, and this is what we find all the time, there's an expectation that everything's on the internet. So if they don't find some of the material you have in your collection because it hasn't been digitized, then they've missed all of that. And I think that's something we struggle with. How do you, I mean, we put a lot of finding aids online with the idea that people will at least know that we have collections. And that actually has driven people to the library. Our usage is actually up, partly because people are finding that, oh, they have that. It's not online, but I can go get it. Or we can make copies for them and deliver those. So I think, that the technology is changing the use and readers' expectations.
First, thank you for being here today. It's great to hear about all the work you've done in your tenure. I have two questions. My first one is, I'm really amazed by what you've had to say about really the expansive services and tools that the State Library has. I had no idea that you worked with town clerks to help them keep their records going. So I'm just curious to know, from your experience and talking with people, what is the best kept secret or resource or tool that the State Library has that most people don't know about?
So the first best kept secret is we have a state library. I was speaking at a group down in Darien, Connecticut a couple weeks ago, and people asked me, I didn't know we had a state library. So that's the first hurdle. I think the depths of our collections, we have large probate collection because a lot of the probate court records came to the state library over periods of time. And for researchers, those are some really valuable things. But even if you're trying to find that, one of the intriguing things, I think, to me is the aerial photographs of the state. So in 1934, Connecticut was the first state to totally photograph the whole state. And that is, a really important benchmark because it's before the hurricane, so you can see what the land looked like. And we've digitized those, we put those up online. That was a big project to do that. But it's a wonderful resource. And then all the subsequent ones have come to us as well. So you can really look at the development of the state over time. This is before Google Earth and all the rest of that. But it is a definitive work. So that's really interesting. I keep stumbling on things I didn't know that we had. And some of a particular interest to some people and not to others. But I think the fact that the collections, some of our indexes are just so interesting. We've been putting a lot of indexes. Staff's been working hard to put online at least indexes like to divorce records. Some of the very early divorces in the state, who knew, women were really getting divorced or, filing for divorce. So there's all of that kind of material locked away in the collections. And the hard thing for us is, archivists can't actually be also doing the research. Their job is to make this stuff accessible. So there's a lot of stories. When I came here, the archivist told me, there's hundreds of theses waiting to be written, based on these collections. And it's still true. But a lot has been done. We've had a lot of students come in and use the collections, and that's great. But, yeah.
No, that's good. I actually spent about 2 hours on the 1934 aerial images
very cool
last
thing.
night. So my other question is, I'm a big user of my local library, and I'm amazed, though, by how many people don't know what their local libraries have. And I've seen in my town this effort to expand and renovate the library being met with such pushback, not only from the financial angle, but for people who just don't get it. What do you find is one of the best defenses for why we need libraries?
Yeah, part of it is we live in this, I'll get to that answer in a minute, but I think part of it, I keep reflecting back on this. Amazon has certainly affected all of our lives. And for some people, that's the answer. It's at my door a couple days, the next day, whatever. That's not what libraries are about. They're certainly there to help provide materials for people who maybe can't afford all of that. But they're not, competing with Amazon. They're not competing with some of the other services. But I think there are people that maybe don't have time in their lives for the library, have not had reason to visit the library yet. And I think the challenge for a lot of libraries is to better inform the public about what they can find there. Librarians used to have a saying about, libraries change lives, and I like to think of it differently. I like to think changing lives need libraries. You never know when you're going to need the library. And you may not use it all the time, but I've been involved. The state does fund, partially funds library construction projects around the state. And I was in one community that it was up for a vote, and it was at a representative town meeting, which I'd never been to, and this was really interesting. Nobody wanted to say the library was a bad thing. Nobody wants to say that. We're right up there with mom and apple pie. But the problem is, I think people, when they're asked to actually shell out some money for that, they haven't been in the library for a while, and they don't know. And it only takes 3 or 4 people in today's world of social media to challenge the library, and suddenly, the whole thing is defeated, which is unfortunate. And I've seen that happen in several towns. I think the library just has to keep making a case through its programming and the services that it offers, why expanded space makes sense. I mean, you know, you don't go into, when you go into a store, you expect that it's going to change from time to time. They move things around, they repaint it, they decorate it. Why do you think the library has to have the same coat of paint it had 20, same colors or the same chairs? I mean, we need libraries today that have furniture that you can easily move around. Students come in, they want to work in groups, and those groups change, you know, so I want to work with this group today, and so having more portable furniture in libraries, having different types of services requires space. And having meeting spaces. There are a lot of libraries that have tutor space. But if you don't use it, you don't know. So the challenge is, how do we make that better known? I mean, I think the case is there. It's making the case more public.
What has been a real highlight for you in your tenure? One of the top things that you'll look back on and remember?
Wow. That's hard. Again, it's like, which kid is, which is my favorite kid? I mean, I think on the one hand, I mentioned earlier, I think the Historic Documents Preservation Fund has been a real highlight. I mean, it was a bipartisan effort. It was really rewarding to work with both sides of the aisle to get that in place and to see it work so successfully. It's just works, and it's done a lot of wonderful things to preserve local records. And I think on the other side, while the education network's been important and I've been a part of that, I think beginning to realize what the resources we could use it for. So creating what was ICON at the time, now it's Research It, and I think growing that. So how do we grow resources to better utilize the internet? And so I think those are two things up there, but I'm just so proud of all the work my staff does. You know, that's what's really cool.
Yeah, they're a great resource.
They are.
They are. I work with a lot of History Day students who go and make use of the library, and that personal connection and the knowledge of the collections is so helpful to them. So, any final questions from the audience? Maybe to just kind of end our time together with Ken. As you look forward to retirement, what will you miss the most of your work, and do you have plans to continue?
Yeah, I mean, I'm going to really miss my staff. It's very stimulating to work with people who are really out there thinking all the time and coming up with great ideas. I'm going to miss working with the library community, the history community. That's been a real joy to be able to go out and see the library in the context of the larger world, and how can we, make that work better. So I'm gonna miss that. I won't miss driving into, although I've started taking the train, so I can't say coming into Hartford has been better. I'm going to continue to be an advocate, both for history and for libraries, so I may show up at the legislature from time to time. I'm free to do that as a citizen. There's some of the organizations I'll continue to be involved in and be able to put a little more time in. It's been a challenge with the demands on my time now to really do some things I've wanted to do with various organizations. So I'll be doing some of that.
And do you have any research projects looming for you?
I do, but not so much research. Working in World War I, I began to be really aware of how extensive our collection is. Probably one of the best state collections on World War I anywhere. And I realized it needs some work. It's got a pretty good finding aid, but I've asked the archivist if I can come back later and do some rehousing, just some really basic stuff, but stuff that I think would be beneficial to the collection. And then, I have other interests. I haven't decided what I want to do yet.
It'll be fun.
Read some books.
That's right, you'll have time to read.
Not get up in the morning, I don't know.
Well, thank you so much for being with us today. I'd invite our audience to join us on December the 10th for our next program, our conversation at noon. And thank you so much to Ken for being with us today and for all his years of service as our state librarian.
Thank you, Rebecca, for having me. It's been a real honor and privilege. Thank you.
Thank you.